To enlighten us on this very serious issue of suicide prevention, hope, and possible action is Dr. Daramola Tayo, Chief Consultant, Psychiatrists, Caro General Hospital, Abuja, and also Lead Consultant, Cognizant Healthcare, Abuja. Welcome to Lens in Africa, sir.
Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you. I'm very comfortable. I feel I'm being profiled at the moment. Am I being profiled, sir?
No, you're not.
Okay. Okay, sir. Also joining us via Zoom is another psychiatrist, Dr. Paul E. Agbo, consultant psychiatrist, Dalhatu Arab Special Hospital, Lafia, Nasarawa State, and coordinator, African Project Against Suicide, North Central Zone. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much. Good evening, all.
Good evening. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Agbo. Suicide seems very counterintuitive to the very human nature. We seem to be to be wired, very hardwired, I must say, to survive, to survive at all costs. What happens? What happens that can be so strong to make an individual override this base instinct of humanity?
Um, Thank you for asking that question. But that suggestion, the premise of this question is based on the fact that there's an assumption that every human being is so wired to resist or want to live at all costs. However, some people aren't so fortunate or are not so wired. And for us in psychiatry, there's a factor we call the resilience factor. And so the assumption is that all of us are resilient. But the truth of the matter is some people are not so resilient. And when stressors come, we react differently. The resilient ones may be able to cope, but the not so resilient ones are unable to cope, and they adopt different coping mechanisms. And unfortunately, one of the coping mechanisms that may be adopted is suicide. And I think that's generally an idea that would answer that question.
All right. So I'm going to move the question back to you. What's your take on it? Like we've been told since we were kids that from the very beginning we're all hardwired. Survival of the fittest. Science has talked about it. But now I'm hearing something different. That there is a certain different level. For not everybody has the same resilience level. Is that so? And could you please further expatiate?
Well, thank you for asking me again. I agree with Dr. Abov, but I would also like to state that the psychological theories of suicide includes the belief that suicide is actually aggression turned inwards.
Oh, wow.
So it's like self-aggressive tendencies. Now, looking at it deeply, different people are wired differently. Looking into your childhood experiences, how you were raised, and your resilience level, like you rightly mentioned. The exposure to adverse events and how you coped with it also helps to build the person you eventually become.
Yeah.
So for those that have been so protected that were not exposed to any adversity, let me break it down simply, they are not tested. So when you suddenly bring a challenge that outweighs their ability to cope, then they feel there is no hope in sight, and they resort to this abnormal way of coping with the adversity to escape the adversity, rather than surmount the adversity.
No, please continue.
Yeah, so it is also good to have some level of exposure to build your resilience, so that you are not overprotected.
Interesting. Overprotected. Dr. Agbo, I'm going to ask you this question. Overprotected and resilience. So are you saying essentially that there are things that can be done to build an individual's resilience to make them less likely to be able to attempt suicide?
Well, in answering the question, let me create scenarios that we're quite familiar with. I can assure you that the average Nigerian is able, by reason of the very adverse environment, very hostile environment we find ourselves, to cope with deviations from the normal compared to, say, somebody in Finland. Um, Recently, we were in Kigali, and for the entire 5 days, they didn't take light at all. And it was a very strange situation for the Nigerian contingent. It was strange to us that you could stay for 5 straight days, no light, with light. And it was strange to the Rwandese that we were contemplating that there should not be light. So imagine a situation where they take light for 12 hours. The Nigerians will see it as normal. The Rwandese will see it as abnormal.
Yeah.
That's the same thing that happens when you're not tested by life events. You are not able to cope, you are not able to mount appropriate responses, you are not able to consider alternatives because you have never been exposed to those kind of situations. People who have been exposed to situations right from childhood, and I must say, there are certain situations that will break the average person. We're not talking about extreme adverse situations like we're finding in some parts of Nigeria now. Those are dangerous situations that can actually precipitate suicide intentions, even in the strongest amongst us. We're not talking about those. We're talking about you learn how to build response. So basically, it is very, very important that people are exposed to certain levels of adversity so that they learn how to respond appropriately. And as you are exposed, you build resilience. Resilience can actually be learned, it can be taught, and it's something that we need to survive in the world as it is.
Well, that's very interesting. Dr. Daramola, I'm going to push you on some of the things you said. Resilience can be learned, it can be taught. Now, let's assume I'm a gentleman who's never been through much adversity in my life, and suddenly I'm out by myself and I'm facing real world crisis where nothing exactly works as it should for a prolonged period of time, and I've come to the end of my rope. How do you begin to teach someone resilience? How do you begin to someone who feels it's all over, it's worthless? How do you bring such a person back and begin to think the person resilient?
Now, looking at it from the context of what you said, I would rather delve into, because you mentioned the fact that the person feels there is no hope and wants to end it all. Now, having talked about resilience, it doesn't mean that everybody that attempts suicide or committed suicide doesn't have some good level of resilience. Like you rightly mentioned, there are overwhelming circumstances. What you term as overwhelming is different from what I term as overwhelming. So that we don't make the mistake of painting the picture that every man that attempts suicide is weak. That's not what we're trying to say. We're just saying that adversity in some instances does not necessarily have to be negative, depending on your interpretation of the events. I give you an example. I have a pen on my pocket. If I lose this pen, I can move on without feeling anything has happened much. But Mr. B may lose the same pen and because of that develop a situation that he cannot cope with because of the value he places on the pen. Probably it was given to his great-grandfather by the late queen, and the great-grandfather passed it to his grandfather, to his father, to him, and it's like a family thing. And now he feels, oh, I'm now the one that misplaced the pen, and it can never be replaced because the queen is no more. We all know that. While I may feel, okay, well, fine and good, it's only a pen. It's an opportunity for King Charles to give me another one. So the way we interpret the events impacts on us differently. So it's not about weakness, it's about perception. Now, factors that may contribute, for example, somebody has just lost a huge amount in investments. I had the story of someone whom I respect who lost his car. And he said, well, thank God, it's only the car, not my life. It's an opportunity to have another car. While another person will sit down after losing a bicycle and like, this
Bring
bicycle,
themselves to
I
stupor.
know how I suffered for it. And because you cannot cope with that situation, it becomes a persistent problem that now leads to another challenge. And the person starts feeling there is no hope. How do I cope with this? And he feels, let me just exit. And the next thing is to think of suicide.
Okay. Dr. Agbo, from listening to the conversation so far, a common trend runs through all of it, which is dealing with powerlessness. At one point in time, every individual is going to deal with powerlessness. How do we cope? We come into a situation where we've done our best. The outcome of this situation is going to be immense. It's not going to be something simple that we can sleep over it and tomorrow we start again. It's going to have immense effect on the rest of our lives. How do we cope with feeling powerless in this situation so that we can still make progress?
Well, from experience, I would say that most people who think that they don't have options are people who keep issues to themselves. Because if you learn to talk, one, it relieves you of that burden of being the only person who is going through the same situation. Two, you may actually hear stories that are worse than your situation. So I discover, even when you see regular people, patients who are not contemplating suicide, that most times their situations become worse because they don't have people to share the conditions with from experience. That's number one. Not talking, not talking. Number two, some people actually can talk, but they don't have people around them that they can trust. So you see people who are willing to share the pain, the burden they're going through, but they don't seem to have people around them that they can share these things with. And I'm saying this because when it comes to prevention, you would notice that some of these preventive strategies factor in these issues of being able to relate, having somebody to talk to. And number three is don't shy away. You have situations where people say, don't tell me any bad news. I don't want to hear any bad news. When the bad news now is your news, you discover that you can't cope because you have, in a way, shielded yourself from the realities that must occur. And so it's funny and it's ironic, but the truth of the matter is we build ourselves up. I don't want to keep on overemphasizing this issue of resilience, even though it's a very significant factor. But the more you expose yourself deliberately to hearing about the kidnap and asking yourself, putting yourself in the situation, what if it were me? What would I do? We need to ask ourselves those questions before it comes knocking on our door. If it's me that armed robbers come to my house and they steal and they kill, what would I do? Contemplating an event before it happens actually helps than for the situation to meet you de novo and you had never thought about it and you didn't have a contingency plan. And so for me, I think that is the way I can look at it. My colleague may shed more light on that scenario. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agbo. So, Doctor.
I love the example he gave, actually. It reminds me of when I was learning how to drive. My teacher said I should imagine the car having a brake failure. And I was like, how can this man be thinking of this? But have you ever imagined that? What would you do?
Yeah.
So he said I should imagine it and think of what I would do to arrest the situation. And that was the first time I actually practically thought of it, that this is a mechanical thing and it could develop a fault at any time. And he made it more complicated by saying, what if I was going down slope?
Wow.
So what do? I press the brake, it's failing. There are kids down the slope. What would I do? The first thing I thought, should I divert to run into a tree? That could be suicidal because I can't predict. Then when I was learning, the cars don't have airbags, you know.
Oh, true.
Yeah.
Very
So
true.
it could be catastrophic. So eventually I got to the point, okay, my gear, because it's manual gear, I could use the gear to slow it down. Then when it is very slow, I put off the engine. The same way, like he said, you imagine the situation and how you can handle it. If you don't run out of imagination, you are possibly likely going to see the lights at the end of the tunnel.
I'm not a big fan of negative contemplations. What if the worst happens? I am a big fan, however, of it was a story of a Russian spy that was caught in the U.S., you know, for espionage, and his lawyer was, you know, talking to him, and he was drawing. He asked for a pen, and he was drawing. And the lawyer asked him, "What's wrong with you? You're in the most dire situation. Aren't you concerned?" And he looked up and said, "Will it help?" Would being, you know, so isn't it possible to build, you know, a more robust, resilient mind without, you know, dwelling on the worst possible situations?
Personally,
Yes, sir.
I tell people, I've heard it, and I tell people, while hoping for the best,
Yeah.
you prepare for the worst.
We've heard that. Well put. Very well put. Very well
Now,
put.
effective problem-solving skills
Yes.
helps in helping you to get over adversity. Good relationship with
Yeah.
people, support helps you. Being able to cope with your environment, belonging to associations. I'm sorry, well, I'm not sorry. Some people may not want to hear this, but believing in a higher power also helps, because you project the adverse events to the higher power, giving hope that something can still happen. So you don't get to the end easily.
Okay, so we'll talk about that now. Dr. Agbo, the issue of, it's desperate times, and a lot of us are quite desperate to get things done and desperate to move from one position to another, socially, economically, and otherwise. What does desperation do? How does desperation factor into suicide, and how can we prevent people from getting to that point?
Well, the problem with desperation is it's like you're setting yourself up. Desperate people are more likely to be unable to cope, are more likely to have planned, to have secondary fallback plans when their plans go wrong. And that's like I said from the beginning, you're setting yourself up. Your plans must be based on reality. At no situation should you put yourself under so much pressure as to say, and you actually hear people say something like, if this doesn't happen, I will die. As simple and as innocent as that statement is, it tells you that that person doesn't have a secondary plan. And that thing may happen. And then the option becomes suicide. So when people make themselves desperate, they usually have not thought about options, because if you think well about all the options, if you are a factual and an analytical person, the first thing is you never put yourself in that situation where you're desperate for anything, because you realize that it could fail. And so moving forward, I think when my colleague talked about self-directed aggression, if there's any classical example of self-directed aggression before it becomes full-fledged suicide, it is the act of desperation. Because you are agitated, you are unsettled, you put yourself under pressure. That is the aggression before you take the final plunge.
All right.
And so if there's anything I want to say to anybody now, it's slow down.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agbo. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, and we look forward to having you again, where we'll have an extended conversation on this very important topic. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so very much, sir.
All right, Dr. Daramola, picking up from where for what he said and the conversation we're having, this is Africa. We're taught to be tough, we're taught to succeed. It's a mixture of the modern world and an old world going. It's a very different world from 20, 30 years ago. The pressures are real and much. We're just coming out from COVID. What can you say to practically help people who are under, are getting to the end of their rope, so to speak? I usually say the worst will happen in some instances, so just get used to have that at the back of your mind. But what can you say, professionally speaking, to people and to those who may be around these people to help prevent suicide?
Coincidentally, this year's theme is giving hope through action.
Yeah.
So there is need for action from everybody. You need to give hope why the person may want to leave. Are you a good friend? Are you being supportive, or you are adding to the problem or making it worse?
Just in about 30 seconds. I'm told we just have about a minute.
Oh, okay. So it's multifaceted.
Yeah.
At the individual level, at the community level, at the society level, at the relationship level. Even as a husband, as a partner, what support are you giving? Are you encouraging, or you are a derogatory person? At the society level, we remove things that could encourage suicide. For example, there was a time that it's either the third mainland or a pesticide. I don't want to talk too much. And people were doing copycat suicide because it was, they report it in glorifying terms. All these are areas that needs to be looked at. So that
in short, we should provide strong, robust support systems for our people, understanding that friends, relatives, colleagues, up to government, we should provide support systems. Understanding we should stop portraying suicides in a way that inspires people to do the same. In some instances. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on this conversation. I have a sneaky feeling we've not concluded this conversation, and we will continue it some other time. Dr. Daramola, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.